Okay, so you know that feeling, right? When you're starting something brand new,
Yeah.
like a new project, a new business idea,
Hmm.
maybe even just trying out a new coffee shop across town. There's that rush of excitement.
Absolutely. That sense of possibility.
But let's be real for a second. A lot of times, mixed in with that excitement, there's also this like undercurrent of uncertainty.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, are you really onto something? Or are you about to pour your heart and soul into an idea that nobody's going to care about?
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're going to tackle in this deep dive. We've been digging into some seriously smart thinking that can help you navigate that foggy, uncertain territory when you're building something new. It's like a cheat sheet for making smarter decisions.
That's right. We're zeroing in on the core principles of the lean startup methodology. And we're pulling from Eric Ries's work, that book that kind of kicked it all off.
Yeah, that's the one. And we're breaking it all down into 7 key areas. Think of this as your crash course.
Sure.
So first up, we've got to define what we're even talking about here. What is a startup? And what's this whole entrepreneurial mindset thing? It's a lot more than you might think.
Exactly. And that's where we're starting. Then we'll move into the idea of validated learning. How do you actually know if what you're doing is working? Not just guessing, but really knowing.
Right, get some proof. And then there's the MVP, the minimum viable product. You know, that idea of starting small to win big. We're breaking that down.
And then we'll dig into the pivot. Because sometimes, and honestly, a lot of times, you got to change course along the way.
That's so true. But how do you know when to do that? So then we'll look at innovation accounting. It's like a new way to measure your progress when the usual metrics just don't cut it.
Makes sense.
Then we'll talk about speed, why being fast is a huge advantage when you're building something new. And last but not least, we'll explore how this whole lean approach actually works in a real organization. How the people, the culture, the whole process all fit together.
Sounds good.
So buckle up, because whether you're cooking up your next big idea or looking to shake things up in an existing business, there's some gold in here for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's dive right in. First up, defining what we're talking about here. Eric Ries has a very specific definition of a startup. He says, a human institution designed to deliver a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty.
I like that. It really captures that element of, not knowing what's going to happen.
Right. And what's interesting is it totally separates the idea of a startup from all those traditional markers like company size or even the industry you're in.
Yeah.
It's all about that uncertainty.
Yeah. And it's funny, that definition actually leads right into another key idea from the lean startup. Entrepreneurs are everywhere.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So it's not just those hoodie-wearing tech founders in a garage, right? This whole way of thinking, this entrepreneurial mindset, it's valuable in all sorts of situations where you're dealing with the unknown, even within big companies, even in like government,
Yeah.
anywhere where you're trying to create something new.
So it's almost like a management style.
Exactly. It's a way to make decisions when you don't have all the answers.
I see. So let's talk benefits. If someone really adopts this mindset, what are the tangible things they might start to see?
Well, first off, it forces you to prioritize learning.
Yeah.
It's all about figuring out what works as quickly as possible.
And how does that actually play out in practice?
You're constantly testing your assumptions, getting feedback, and adjusting your approach. It's not about being right from the start. It's about being open to being wrong and then learning from it.
And I imagine that leads to more efficient use of resources too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Because when you're acknowledging that uncertainty, you're naturally less likely to chuck a ton of money at something before you have some evidence that it's going to work.
That makes sense. Lean startup is all about like minimizing waste.
Yeah, yep, exactly.
Yeah.
And it also fosters adaptability. You're not locked into a rigid plan. You're able to pivot based on what you're learning.
Okay, so that all sounds pretty good, but let's flip it around. What happens if someone doesn't embrace this entrepreneurial mindset? What are some of the pitfalls they might stumble into?
Oh, man, I've seen it happen a lot. The biggest one is building something that nobody wants.
Ouch.
Yeah. It's easy to get so attached to your idea that you don't really stop to see if it actually solves a problem that people are willing to pay for.
Right, because you're so in love with your own vision.
Totally. And then there's a whole resistance to change thing. People get stuck in their ways, even when the data is telling them they need to change course.
It's like that classic saying, what got you here won't get you there.
Exactly. And then you miss out on opportunities, because if you're not approaching this as a learning process, a way to experiment and innovate, you're probably not going to stumble upon those unexpected breakthroughs.
Okay, so all of this is great in theory, but can you give me some real-world examples? Like, are there any big, well-known U.S. companies that are really good at embodying this entrepreneurial mindset even now?
Oh, absolutely. Intuit is a great one. They actually encourage their employees to come up with and test new ideas, like even if it's not part of their main job. They call them entrepreneurs.
I like that term. So they're basically fostering that entrepreneurial spirit within their existing company structure.
Exactly. Then you've got Amazon. They're like the poster child for experimentation.
Oh, yeah, they're always trying new things.
Right. They're not afraid to fail, and they learn from those failures just as much as their successes.
I feel like Google has historically been really good at this too.
Yeah, they had that whole 20% time thing where employees could work on side projects. It led to some pretty amazing things like Gmail and Google Maps.
Wow, that's incredible.
Oh.
So on the flip side, are there any companies that come to mind that maybe struggled or even failed because they didn't have this kind of flexible, learning-focused approach?
Oh, for sure. Kodak is the classic cautionary tale.
Right, the film company.
Yep. They actually invented the digital camera, but they were so slow to adapt to the digital market because they were so stuck in their old ways.
Yeah, that's wild.
And then there's Blockbuster. Remember them?
Oh, yeah, the video rental place.
They had the chance to jump on the whole online streaming thing early on, but they didn't. They just didn't see it coming, or maybe didn't want to.
And then Netflix swooped in and changed the game.
Exactly. And honestly, you can see similar things happening in like the publishing industry. The companies that were slow to embrace digital books and new formats really lost out.
So I'm seeing a pattern here. It's all about adaptability.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I get it. This entrepreneurial mindset is important, but let's be practical here. How does it actually lead to more money, more sales? Like, what's the bottom line impact?
We'll look at Intuit again. By empowering their employees to be innovative, they come up with new products that meet evolving customer needs, and that leads to more revenue.
Makes sense. Happy customers, happy bottom line.
Right. And Amazon, with all their experimenting, they can quickly figure out what's working and what's not.
So they can double down on the winners and cut their losses on the losers.
Exactly. That's efficiency.
Uh-huh.
And Google, their history of innovation, that's what brought us products like Search and Android, which obviously generate a ton of revenue.
All right, so let's say someone listening to this wants to start cultivating this mindset. Where do they even begin?
Well, first, build a culture of experimentation. Whether you're in a team or running a whole company, encourage people to try new things, test their ideas.
No matter how small.
Exactly. And get comfortable with uncertainty. Don't pretend you have all the answers from the get-go.
That's a good one.
And finally, empower your team. Good ideas can come from anywhere, not just the top.
All right, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about validated learning. This seems like it's all about getting out of our heads and actually seeing if our ideas hold up in the real world.
That's it, exactly. It's about moving from assumptions to actual evidence.
Less guessing, more knowing.
Exactly. And it's all based on this core idea, the build, measure, learn feedback loop.
You mentioned that earlier. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So you start by building something. It could be a basic version of your product, or even just a simple experiment to test a specific hypothesis.
Okay, so far so good.
Then you measure. You look at how real users actually interact with what you've built. What do they do? What don't they do?
Get that data.
And then, most importantly, you learn from that data. What worked, what didn't. And that learning directly feeds back into your next build, your next experiment.
It's a continuous cycle of improvement.
Exactly.
So why is this whole validated learning thing so important? What's the big payoff?
Well, for one, it minimizes waste. You're not spending months building features that nobody ends up using because you're getting constant feedback.
That makes a lot of sense.
It also forces you to be data-driven. Your decisions aren't based on gut feelings or what the loudest person in the room thinks. It's about looking at the actual evidence.
Okay, I like that.
And because you're making those adjustments based on real data, you actually end up moving faster in the long run.
That's interesting. So by slowing down initially to test and learn, you actually speed up overall.
Exactly.
Okay, so what are the risks if you don't prioritize this whole validated learning thing?
The biggest one is, well, you build the wrong product. You spend all this time and energy creating something that nobody actually wants.
That's not ideal.
Not at all. You also end up wasting resources. You're
Yeah.
pouring money and time into features that don't deliver value. And your growth is going to be way slower because you're not really understanding your market. You're kind of just stumbling around in the dark.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture. Can you give me some examples of companies that really get this validated learning thing right?
Sure. Think about Dropbox.
Hmm.
Before they built their whole super complex file sharing platform, they actually just made a simple video showing how it would work.
Oh, yeah, I remember that video. It was really well
It
done.
was. And that video was basically a test. They wanted to see if people were even interested in the idea before they invested heavily in development.
So they validated the demand before building the product.
Exactly.
That's smart.
Another great example is Zappos. In the early days, they didn't have a massive warehouse full of shoes.
Really? So how did they sell shoes online?
They would literally go to local shoe stores, take pictures of the shoes, and list them on their website. And when someone ordered a pair, they'd go buy them and ship them out.
Wow, that's scrappy.
It was.
Yeah.
But it allowed them to test the market and prove that people were willing to buy shoes online without taking on a huge risk.
I see. So they validated the model before scaling it up.
Exactly. And then you have companies like Buffer, which are really transparent about their process. They'll release a very basic version of a new feature and then get feedback from users before building it out further.
That's a cool approach. It's like they're co-creating with their users.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what about companies that maybe didn't prioritize this learning process?
You see it all the time. Companies that spend years developing their product in secret only to launch and find out that nobody wants it. Or they rely too much on traditional market research, like focus groups, which can be really misleading.
Right, because people don't always do what they say they'll do.
Exactly. And then there are the companies that build a ton of features that they think are cool without really understanding what their users actually need.
So they end up with a product that's all bells and whistles, but no real substance.
Right.
Okay, so I think we've established that validated learning is important, but how does it translate to financial success? How does it actually lead to more money, more sales?
Well, look at Dropbox. Because they validated that core demand early on, they were able to grow incredibly quickly.
More users, more revenue.
Exactly. And Zappos, by minimizing their initial risk, they were able to confirm that their model worked before investing heavily. And Buffer, by building what their users actually want, they have high customer satisfaction and low churn, which means more recurring revenue.
Okay, so for someone listening to this who wants to start using validated learning, what would you recommend they do?
First, get really clear about your hypotheses. What do you believe to be true about your customers, your product, your market?
Okay, so write down your assumptions.
Then design experiments to test those assumptions. This could be launching a basic version of your product, running A/B tests on your website, all sorts of things.
So put those assumptions to the test.
Right. And then you got to measure the results, not just vanity metrics, but actual data that tells you how people are behaving.
So no fooling yourself with numbers that don't really matter.
Exactly. And finally, be open to learning from that data, even if it tells you you're wrong. Use those learnings to adjust your approach.
Okay, I like it. It's a structured, data-driven way to approach building something new.
It is.
All right, let's move on to our third key area, the minimum viable product, or MVP. This term gets thrown around a lot, so let's get specific here. In your words, what is an MVP?
All right, well, Eric Ries defines it as the minimum set of features needed to learn from early evangelists.
Early evangelists. I
Right.
like that.
Yeah, it's a catchy term for those early adopters who are passionate about your idea and willing to try it out, even if it's not perfect.
So it's not about building a half-baked product. It's about building the smallest possible thing that delivers value and lets you start learning.
Exactly.
And the goal here is to avoid building something nobody wants and to maximize your learning for every dollar you spend, right?
That's it. It's about being smart and efficient with your resources. And it's important to remember, an MVP isn't the end goal. It's just the first step towards a much bigger vision.
Right. So you're basically using it to test the waters and gather feedback before you invest heavily in building out a fully featured product.
Absolutely. And those early evangelists, they're often willing to overlook some missing features if the core problem you're solving is something they really care about.
They see the potential.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk benefits. What are the advantages of taking this MVP approach?
Well, first off, you get to market faster. You're not spending months or years in development before you get your product in front of real users.
Speed is key, especially in today's world.
Absolutely. You also save a ton of money on development because you're focusing on the essentials.
And I imagine there's less risk involved too.
For sure. You're validating your idea before you go all in. So you're less likely to end up with a product nobody wants.
All right, so what about the flip side? What are the risks of not using an MVP?
Well, You might waste a ton of resources building something that's not viable.
Ouch.
You might also miss out on valuable market opportunities because you're moving too slowly. And without that early feedback, you're basically flying blind. You don't really know if you're on the right track.
Okay, so can you give me some examples of companies that did the MVP thing really well?
Sure. Twitter started as a super simple SMS-based platform for sharing short messages. All the other features came later, based on user feedback.
So they started with the bare minimum and then iterated based on what their users wanted.
Right. Instagram launched as a basic photo sharing app with just a few filters.
Yeah.
The focus was on that core experience of capturing and sharing photos.
And now it's a behemoth.
Exactly. And Airbnb, they literally started by renting out air mattresses in their apartment to test the concept of peer-to-peer accommodation.
That's amazing. They really started from nothing.
It did, and it worked.
Okay, so what about companies that maybe didn't take the MVP route and might have suffered because of it?
You often see companies that spend years developing a product in secret with all the bells and whistles, only to launch and realize they built the wrong thing.
It's like they were so focused on the product itself that they forgot about the market.
Right. And then there are the companies that are so obsessed with perfection that they never actually launch anything.
They get stuck in that endless cycle of tweaking and refining.
Exactly. And then there are the companies that ignore feedback. They get early signals that they're on the wrong track, but they just keep going,
It's like they're driving with their eyes closed.
pretty much.
Okay, so how did those MVPs contribute to the success of companies like Twitter, Instagram, and Airbnb?
Well, for Twitter, that simple start allowed them to grow really quickly and get feedback that shaped the platform's evolution.
So they were agile and responsive.
Exactly. Instagram's focus on that core photo sharing experience resonated with users and led to rapid growth. And Airbnb's scrappy MVP proved that their concept was viable and set the stage for massive expansion.
Okay, so let's make this actionable. For someone who's listening to this and has a new idea they want to test, what are the steps they need to take to define and build their own MVP?
All right, first things first, define the core problem you're solving. What's the one essential thing you want to achieve?
Okay, so get clear on the why.
Right. Then strip away everything that's not absolutely necessary, build the smallest possible product or service that addresses that core problem,
Keep it simple.
and then get it in front of those early evangelists, those passionate early adopters who are willing to give you honest feedback.
Find your people.
And then pay attention to that feedback. What are they saying? What are they struggling with? What do they love? Use that to iterate and improve your MVP.
So build, measure, learn. It all comes back to that, right?
It does.
Okay, let's move on to the next principle, the pivot. I feel like this is where things get really interesting.
It is. Because in the startup world, pivoting is almost inevitable.
So it's not about being stubborn and sticking to your original plan no matter what. It's about being flexible and adapting based on what you're learning.
Exactly. And, Eric Ries has a great way of defining it. He says a pivot is a structured course correction designed to test a new fundamental hypothesis about the product, strategy, and engine of growth.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, but it basically means you're changing direction based on what you're learning, but you're not abandoning your overall vision.
So you're adjusting the sails, but you're still heading towards the same destination.
Exactly. And, some of the most successful companies in the world have pivoted, like drastically pivoted.
You mentioned a few earlier. Can you give us some more examples?
Sure. Look at PayPal. They started out with this idea of digital cash for Palm Pilots, those old handheld devices.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that was a while ago.
It was. But then they saw this huge opportunity in online payments, especially on eBay, and they pivoted to focus on that.
And that turned out pretty well for them.
Right. And Microsoft, they weren't always the operating system giant. They started by making basic interpreters for early PCs.
That's fascinating. So they went from software tools to like the foundation of the entire computer ecosystem.
Exactly. And Flickerbed, believe it or not, started as a feature within an online game. They realized people were more into the photo sharing aspect than the game itself, so they pivoted.
So they completely changed their business model based on what their users were doing.
Yep. And those are just a few examples. There are countless others.
Okay, so you also mentioned that speed is crucial when it comes to pivoting. Why is that?
Well, because the longer you wait to pivot, the more resources you waste on a path that's not working. Time, money, energy, all of it.
It's like digging yourself deeper into a hole.
Exactly. And Eric Ries talks about this concept of achieving failure.
What does that even mean?
It means you can execute a bad plan perfectly. You can be on time, on budget, hit all your milestones, but if you're building the wrong thing, it doesn't matter.
So you need to be able to recognize when you're headed down the wrong path, no matter how well you're executing.
Right. And pivoting is how you do that.
Okay, so what are the real benefits of embracing the pivot?
First, it helps you stay relevant. The market is always changing, customer needs are evolving, so you got to be able to adapt.
Otherwise, you get left behind.
Exactly. It also helps you avoid that achieving failure trap. You can course correct before you waste too much. And each pivot is a learning opportunity. You're not starting from scratch. You're building on what you've already learned.
Okay, so what are the downsides of not pivoting?
Well, you might stick with a failing idea for way too long. You might run out of resources. And you might miss out on opportunities because you're so focused on your original plan.
So you're basically shooting yourself in the foot by not being flexible.
Pretty much.
Okay, can you think of any examples of companies that maybe struggled because they didn't pivot when they should have?
Oh yeah, Kodak and Blockbuster are the classic examples. They were both slow to adapt to the digital world.
And they paid the price.
They did. And there are plenty of other companies that hold on to outdated technologies or business models for too long.
It's like they're clinging to the past.
They are. And sometimes it's because of internal biases or a lack of understanding of the market or even just being too emotionally attached to the original vision.
So it's not always about logic. It can be about ego, too.
Absolutely.
All right, so we've talked about some successful pivots. How did those pivots by companies like Slack, YouTube, and Flickr lead to their success?
Well, Slack, by pivoting from gaming to workplace communication, they tapped into a massive and growing market.
They found a real need and filled it.
Exactly. YouTube, by realizing people wanted to share all kinds of videos, not just dating profiles, they opened up the platform to a much wider audience.
And that led to massive growth.
It did. And Flickr, by focusing on photo sharing, they capitalized on the rise of digital photography and online communities.
So they found their niche and ran with it.
I did.
Okay, so for someone listening who's trying to figure out if they need to pivot, what should they be looking for?
First, pay attention to your metrics. What's the data telling you? Are you hitting your targets? Are you seeing the kind of engagement you expected?
So don't ignore the numbers.
Right. Be open to the idea that your initial assumptions might be wrong, and ask yourself tough questions. Is it the vision that needs to change, or the strategy, or just a specific feature?
So constantly reassess and be willing to adjust.
Exactly. And when you do pivot, make sure you're using everything you've learned so far. Don't just throw it all away.
Build on your experience.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about how we actually measure progress in all of this. That brings us to innovation accounting. This sounds like it's about looking beyond the traditional financial metrics.
It is. Because when you're in startup mode, those traditional metrics don't always tell the whole story. You might not have revenue yet, or your user base is still small.
So you need a different way to gauge your progress.
Exactly. And that's what innovation accounting is all about. It's about measuring your learning and your progress towards validating your assumptions.
And you mentioned there are 3 key milestones in this framework. Can you walk us through them?
Sure. The first one is establishing a baseline. You launch your MVP and you start tracking your key metrics. What are your starting points?
Okay, so know where you stand.
Right. Then you start tuning the engine. You run experiments to see if you can improve those metrics. You're testing different approaches, iterating on your products.
So make those numbers go up.
Exactly. And then, based on the results of your experiments, you decide whether to pivot or persevere.
So are you making progress or do you need to change course?
Right. It's a data-driven decision.
I like it. So what are the benefits of using this innovation accounting approach?
Well, it gives you a much clearer picture of your progress, even when you don't have traditional financial metrics to rely on. It also helps you make smarter decisions about when to pivot. And it creates accountability. You're not just experimenting for the sake of it. You're measuring the impact of your efforts.
Okay, so what happens if you don't use innovation accounting?
You might end up focusing on the wrong metrics.
Like vanity metrics.
Exactly. Things that look good on paper but don't actually reflect real progress. You might also waste time and resources on efforts that aren't working. And it's harder to make those pivot decisions because you don't have clear data to guide you.
So you're basically flying blind again.
Pretty much.
Okay, can you give me some examples of companies that are using innovation accounting well?
Sure. A lot of early-stage SaaS companies are really good at this. They track metrics like customer acquisition cost, customer lifetime value, and churn rate.
Those are all about understanding the unit economics of the business.
Exactly. Companies that do a lot of A/B testing are also using innovation accounting principles. They're constantly measuring the impact of different changes.
So they're always experimenting and learning.
And then you have companies that are really good at product-led growth. They use in-product analytics to understand how users are interacting with their product and to identify areas for improvement.
Okay, so what are some common mistakes companies make when they're not using these kinds of metrics?
Well, they might focus too much on things like signups or downloads without looking at engagement or retention. Those early numbers can be misleading if people aren't actually using your product.
Right, you need to look beyond the surface.
Exactly. And sometimes companies make decisions based on gut feelings or opinions rather than looking at the data.
It's about taking the emotion out of it.
And sometimes they just don't have clear metrics in place to measure the success of their efforts. They're just kind of hoping for the best.
Okay, so how does innovation accounting actually lead to more revenue and sales?
Well, for SaaS companies, by understanding their unit economics, they can make sure they're acquiring customers profitably.
So they're building a sustainable business.
Right. Companies that use A/B testing well can optimize their conversion rates, which means more customers and more revenue. And companies that nail product-led growth can create products that naturally attract and retain users, which reduces their marketing costs and leads to more organic growth.
Okay, so for someone who wants to start using innovation accounting, where do they begin?
First, identify your actionable metrics. These are the metrics that are truly meaningful and can actually inform your decisions.
So no vanity metrics.
Right. Then, establish a baseline with your MVP. Know where you're starting from. Then, run experiments to move those metrics in the right direction. Analyze the results and decide whether to pivot or persevere.
Mm.
And finally, always look at cohort-based metrics over time to get a true picture of user behavior.
Okay, that's a great roadmap.
It is.
All right, let's move on to speed. It feels like in today's world, being fast is more important than ever.
Absolutely. As I say, speed wins. The faster you can learn and adapt, the more likely you are to succeed.
And one of the key practices for achieving speed is continuous deployment. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. It's basically a way to automate the process of releasing software updates and new features. The goal is to be able to deploy changes very frequently, even multiple times a day.
So it's about removing all the bottlenecks and friction in the release process.
Exactly. And it requires having really good systems in place to catch any problems and roll back changes quickly if needed.
Right, because you don't want to break things.
And continuous deployment goes hand in hand with working in small batches.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Instead of working on big monolithic features that take months to develop, you break things down into smaller, more manageable pieces.
So it's like agile development on steroids?
Kind of. It allows you to get feedback faster, iterate more quickly, and reduce the risk of big, messy deployments.
Okay, so why is prioritizing speed so important? What are the benefits?
Well, first, you learn faster. You're getting feedback from your users more frequently, which means you can adjust your course more quickly.
So you're more agile and responsive.
Exactly. You're also less likely to miss out on opportunities because you can adapt to changes in the market quickly.
And I imagine you avoid a lot of wasted effort, too.
Absolutely. If you're getting feedback early and often, you're less likely to spend months building the wrong thing.
Okay, so what are the downsides of moving slowly?
Your learning cycles are longer, which means you're less adaptable. You're more likely to miss out on opportunities. And you might end up building something that nobody wants because you're not getting that feedback early enough.
So you're basically putting yourself at a competitive disadvantage.
You are.
Okay, can you give me some examples? Okay, so you know that feeling, right? When you're starting something brand new,
Yeah.
like a new project, a new business idea, maybe even just trying out a new coffee shop across town. There's that rush of excitement.
Absolutely. That sense of possibility.
But let's be real for a second. A lot of times, mixed in with that excitement, there's also this like undercurrent of uncertainty.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, are you really onto something? Or are you about to pour your heart and soul into an idea that nobody's going to care about?
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're going to tackle in this deep dive. We've been digging into some seriously smart thinking that can help you navigate that foggy, uncertain territory when you're building something new. It's like a cheat sheet for making smarter decisions.
That's right. We're zeroing in on the core principles of the lean startup methodology. And we're pulling from Eric Ries's work, that book that kind of kicked it all off.
Yeah, that's the one. And we're breaking it all down into 7 key areas. Think of this as your crash course.
Sure.
So first up, we've got to define what we're even talking about here. What is a startup? And what's this whole entrepreneurial mindset thing. It's a lot more than you might think.
Exactly. And that's where we're starting. Then we'll move into the idea of validated learning. How do you actually know if what you're doing is working? Not just guessing, but really knowing.
Right, get some proof. And then there's the MVP, the minimum viable product. You know, that idea of starting small to win big. We're breaking that down.
And then we'll dig into the pivot. Because sometimes, and honestly, a lot of times, you got to change course along the way.
That's so true. But how do you know when to do that? So then we'll look at innovation accounting. It's like a new way to measure your progress when the usual metrics just don't cut it.
Makes sense.
Then we'll talk about speed, why being fast is a huge advantage when you're building something